Okay, welcome to everyone around the world and welcome from London, England, this gloriously hot and beautiful country as we have it right at this very moment. The subject which I'm dealing with tonight is the Talmud on trial. Now, of course, to understand the concept of the Talmud on trial, we need to, in a way, understand what the Talmud was and is, and why others should have been upset with what is in the Talmud in its dozens of tractates which there are. The Talmud, as we know it, fizzes in so many ways. Has excitement and exhilaration and powerful education. And this is what it is basically, which you have in the slide in front of you. At its core, the Torah is a collection of teachings, as it says, regarding two aspects of the Jewish world. One is halacha, which means law. These are dealing with the nitty-gritty of what you do and how you do it as an everyday Jewish person. And the other is agadah. Some people, which means here they've translated it as ethics, but you could translate it as stories or many other mystical ideas which go on. And many people would say that the agadah section is everything except halakha, is everything except the law. And it is this bit of the Talmud which will become the most contentious as we go through this evening. Now, the two sections of the Talmud is the Gemara, which is the lengthy part, the explanations around what is called the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is the traditional oral law placed down around the year 200, although it contains within it hundreds of years of learning and studies and ideas and concepts. Now, one of the main modern writers on the Talmud is known as Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz. He was a polymath, and by his later years, he had completed a comprehensive translation and a commentary on the whole of the Babylonian Talmud, and we'll come on to that, why the Babylonian Talmud. He was awarded for his contribution to the study of Talmud, and he made it much more accessible to the worldwide in a way that wasn't before. And he wrote, if the Bible is the cornerstone of Judaism, then the Talmud is a central pillar. The Talmud holds it all together. The Talmud is in many ways the most important book in Jewish culture. It is the backbone of creativity and continuity of Jewish national life. No other Jewish work has a comparable influence on the theory, the practice, the concepts, the ideas of Jewish life. It shapes the spiritual content and serves as a guide to conduct. Jewish survival is dependent on the study of the Talmud. And there was one comment from a period later, 100 years ago, which said that if the community failed to be learning the Talmud, the community would soon decline and disappear. And that was absolutely true in that case. Now, the Talmud is a study and a summary of the oral law, which is developed over centuries by scholars and rabbis in hundreds and thousands. They lived in Palestine, or what we would call today Israel, and gave rise to what is known as the Palestinian Talmud, or the Jerusalem Talmud, Talmud Yerushalmi. And there were those Jews who lived in Babylon, which today would be something like Iraq. And they would give rise to the Babylonian Talmud, which was Talmud Babli. So we have two Talmuds, which are very similar and yet very different. They are different in language, they are different in length, they are different in the amount of time spent on those. But the Jerusalem Talmud, the Talmud coming out of Israel, is considered slightly more authentic, older, and more something to be examined if you want authenticity. Now, the oral law, known as the Mishnah, as I've already stated, started way back in the Second Temple period. So you're talking well over 2,000 years ago. But that definition of the oral law is too simplistic when it comes to the Talmud. And this is where our problems begin to arise. for it is the repository of thousands of years of Jewish and Hebrew wisdom. The oral tradition was handed down according to tradition by the law which came down with Moses from Mount Sinai, and somehow the written law, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, were received at the same time as the oral law, because without the oral law, the written law has no functional meaning. The Talmud expands. It contains within it areas which seem to be completely haphazard. They are difficult to understand, often unintelligible, often controversial, perverse, obscure, debates, discussions, arguments on many subjects: law, history, philosophy, psychology, legends, stories, science, medicine. Is there no end? Anecdotes and even humor. There is seemingly no end to what is contained within the Talmud in these over 30 tractates of the Talmud. 1.5 million words. Without it, simply Jewish life would be unintelligible. Without the oral law and the discussions, Jewish life wouldn't know what it means to be kosher or not, and what it would mean to how to marry, what to marry, who to marry, when to divorce. All these subjects would be discussed. And even we wouldn't know what it would mean for men to wear tefillin, black boxes, but what's that all about? But the Talmud is not a definitive conclusion to matters of Jewish law. Nothing, that's the halakha bit, nothing is decided in the Talmud as such. That is then left to others. Now, I want to show some pictures and artistic representations because they, the artists, want to represent the ultimate concept of Jewish intellectualism. It was not just for the elite, it was not just for the clever, it was not just for scholars, it was a potentiality for everybody to have the ability to learn what it is to be a Talmudic scholar. And notice that when the painting here talks about Talmud, it doesn't say reading Talmud. We don't read the Talmud like people read books. People study the Talmud. They learn the Talmud. It is there to be learned and studied all the time. And when people go to study further about the Talmud, they go to Talmudical college. It is not called a Torah college. It is called a Talmudic college in a yeshiva. So that Talmud dominates the learning. People spend years, literally years, and indeed their whole lifetime studying the Talmud. And when students pore over text to illuminate and elucidate the sharpest of problems, the deepest of concepts, the nuance of a letter of a word which is contained therein. Now, they can even debate over matters which have no relevance today. They can debate and discuss about to do with the sacrifice of an animal in the temple period, which obviously has no relevance today, but is still there to be discussed. And because of the haphazard nature of Talmud, you begin to get areas discussed which seemingly have nothing to do with the actual subject which is being discussed. The only way I could give an idea is that if you sat down with 10 people around a dinner table and you're discussing, I don't know, the Canadian election, and while discussing it, somebody says, there are bears in Canada. And before you know where you are, people are off discussing the nuance of a polar bear or other types of bears which may exist or not exist. And in a way, the Talmud does that. Rabbis are discussing across each other, between each other of different generations. So that, for instance, as an example, in the tractate dealing with Shabbat, the Sabbath, there you've got people discussing all the nuances. One of the longest tractates of the Talmud, they're discussing about the Sabbath, and then suddenly somebody will say, well, what about the wicks which we light on the Sabbath? And somebody say, wicks, I think about Hanukkah, and suddenly they'll bring in Hanukkah. So we have to appreciate that within the Talmud, And we and those Jews at that time would understand, as it was being laid down between maybe the Palestinian Talmud ended in around the year 425 of the Common Era, and the Babylonian Talmud went on longer, and that is debated. It is not homogeneous. It contains within it bizarre and conflicting opinions from numerous, 1,000 different rabbis talking across each other. And therefore, it can be often irrational, unintelligible, and on occasions offensive and unacceptable. Now, this is a page of Talmud. Who but a learned Jew in the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, around the year 1000, could possibly understand? It wouldn't have looked like this because this is a more modern page, but who would understand a page of Talmud? It is a classic piece of work. The printers designed it in a certain way that was not only used in the Jewish world, but in other ways. And the center column contains the oral law, that is called the Mishnah and the Gemara, making the Talmud. And around it goes commentaries. And then around those goes super commentaries. And this makes up what is known, as it says there, a daf, which is a page. This was laid out, in fact, by Gentile printers, and it's first known from the 16th century, this particular design of a page. Now, to me, there is a precursor or a connection with Lockdown University. There was an idea in 1923 by who was known as Rabbi Meir Shapiro, who you can visit where his yeshiva was in Lublin in Poland. And he had an idea that whilst I'm learning a page of Talmud, I want others to learn it as well. I'd like others in my town of Lublin to be learning it. And whilst others in Lublin are learning it, why not have it in other cities of Poland? And if in other cities of Poland, why not all around? Let's get international education. And this is the origin of what is known as Daf Yomi, the day or the page of a particular day. Said he, what a great thing. A Jew travels by boat and takes Gemara Brachot, that's the Gemara, one page of what we looked at just before, of Brachot, a particular section dealing with, as it said, Brachot, blessings. He takes it under his arm. He travels for 15 days from Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, and he goes all the way to America. And each day he learns a daf. So you'll often see in certain communities that a person is carrying around a Talmud and they're learning a particular page. When he arrives in America, he enters a Beis Midrash. This is a house of learning, not a synagogue necessarily, but a place where people learn. And he enters there in New York. So he's now gone from the land of Israel, and he's come to New York. And he finds Jews learning the very same page that he studied on that day, and he joins with them, and he feels at one with them. Another Jew then leaves New York, the States, and he travels to Brazil or Japan. And he first goes to the Beit Midrash, the house of learning, of study, where he finds everyone learning exactly the same page that he himself learned that very day. And he says, could there be greater unity of hearts than this? And isn't this, in a way, established 100 years ago? Isn't there something great about that, which in fact the university system, which here we're talking on, has carried on with that, making education universal? But by the Middle Ages, fires were being lit. The world was changing. Christendom was on the attack. There were crusades. Christians became more aware of Jews. The world was more insecure for Jews. Jews were being attacked and killed, and the Jews were insecure with their Christian neighbors. And the Christian world was shouting and screaming and fighting among themselves. They were fighting against their heresy. The Jews were not heretics according to strict definition, but they were the heretics par excellence. So they were looking for Christian heresy. 1,000 years and more after the establishment of Christianity, they were still insecure in what they believed and how their belief should be carried out. And this would infiltrate into all areas of Christendom, and they would attack heretics where they found them. One of the main people who was an instigator in this idea was somebody known as Peter the Venerable of Cluny. He was a major learned person who lived, we can see, 11th, 12th century. And he turned the ridicule of the Talmud into a hatred of the Talmud, because he knew he had the ability, because others were learning how to read Hebrew and Aramaic. He learned what was in the Talmud. And once he knew what was in the Talmud, he said, this is ridiculous. This is nonsense. This is rubbish. This is a perversion. This is an insult to true religion. Now, whilst, he said, Jews and Christians share the same common sacred literature, we all share the 5 books of Moses, Christianity never attacked, and never does attack, the actual words of the 5 books of Moses. That is sacred to Christianity. Separate with another subject is Islam, but it's sacred to Christianity. Now, they may interpret it differently. They may look at it and say that we don't understand it the way you understand it, but they don't alter the words. They see within the Old Testament, the 5 books of Moses, they actually see it as something, as a precursor of the coming of Jesus Christ, as a precursor of the coming of Christianity. So that, as one example, whilst we Jews would look at the story of Adam and Eve in a particular way, the artists of the Christian world and Christianity itself would say, no, we see something different. We see that the tree in the Garden of Eden is an image and a precursor of the cross, and that the Adam and Eve story has a different meaning, and it is all about original sin. And this is just one example of the difference, although we all agree that it's sacred, the difference between them. Now, simultaneously to having this holy, sacred literature, for Christians, there was the New Testament as their secondary source, and for them, holy literature. And for the Jews, it would, by definition, as you've already seen, an absolute backbone of Judaism would be the Talmud. In the Middle Ages, Christians became more aware of the Talmud than ever before. And as a large number of Jews became and lived within Christian communities, and there were Christian apostates, or Jewish apostates to Christianity, and sometimes the other way around, they gained a knowledge of Hebrew, and they could use the Old Testament, and therefore they would see it as a foretelling of the coming of Jesus. Now, Peter the Venerable was an abbot of Cluny, as I said, in the 12th century, and he was a person who discussed the Talmud. He, quote, held it up to ridicule. So everything which I've said about the Talmud and its inconsistencies and its bizarreness and its lack of homogeneity and all the other stuff which is included in, he didn't read that with any historic sensitivity or religious sensitivity. He simply saw it as ridiculous. About the same time as Peter the Venerable of Cluny lived the man known in Spain as the Rambam, or Maimonides. Now, Maimonides today would be viewed as one of the greatest of rabbis of all time. Great rabbi, great doctor, great philosopher, great analyst of Jewish world. But at the time, the Rambam, in his period and slightly after his death, was viewed as a heretic. So not only was Christianity fighting against heresy, but Judaism at the same time, it too was fighting against its own heresy, where things didn't go according to what they believed to be the ultimate truth in the Jewish world. And they attacked him over his codification of Jewish law. So they said, how can you do that? The Talmud is a codification of Jewish law, even if it isn't. You can't do that and not quote where your sources are. And he also, the Rambam is most famous, Maimonides is most famous for writing what is known as a guide to the perplexed, or for the perplexed. It's one of the most famous philosophical works, one of the most difficult to understand. And this was seen by the rabbis of Montpellier, who were across the border from Spain into France, as an absolute heresy. And they were led by Rabbi Joseph Grundy, who viewed the views of the Rambam of diminishing the role of the Talmud, and more, that the thoughts of his guide to the perplexed and his thought on resurrection and Aristotelian philosophy denying miracles was completely unacceptable. And those rabbis called for a ban on the works of the Rambam. They should be banned and, if necessary, destroyed. Now, destruction of works is not new in history, or even in the Jewish world, it wasn't that new. At that point, those from France, known as the anti-Maimonists, those against Maimonides, knew of the Inquisition, which was just starting at about the same time in the mid-13th century. The Inquisition is not all about the Spanish Inquisition. It started much earlier in the 13th century. And they appealed to the church and the Dominican friars, who were the founders of the Inquisition. Domine Carnes, the watchdogs of the Lord, gave rise to the name Dominican, to support their efforts against heresy. As a result, the Dominicans came in, saw the works of Maimonides, and in 1232, they burnt the works of Maimonides. Jonah Grundy, the rabbi who had wanted help by bringing in to the Inquisition into the Jewish world, exclaimed when he saw the burning of the works of Maimonides, "Oh my God, what have I done?" Now, St. Dominic, who you can see on the slide, was the founder of the Dominican order, and he attacked at about the same time those who were known as the Cathars, who were viewed as heretical due to their belief, it would appear, of two gods. They believed in a good God of heaven and the New Testament, and an evil god, Satan. And the artist portrays a particular miracle and shows within this painting the miracle of St. Dominic's book flying up into the air, whilst there's an auto de fe, there's an act of faith where the books are being burnt. This image actually comes and is associated with St. Dominic. It is used in many, if you were to look in many different volumes of different things, you would see this image as if it came at other places, but it's actually from St. Dominic. Then the Pope gets involved. Pope Gregory IX instituted the Inquisition to prosecute heresy and indicted the Talmud. For the Talmud fails to distinguish, he said, between holy and profane, and he said it contains nonsense and is stopping Jews to convert into Christianity. So 1,000 years after, now 1,200 years after the foundation of Christianity, they are still wanting and needing the Jews to convert. And this is a primary thing of essential primary Christianity. So others have already done before, let the Inquisition in to burn books, and the Pope therefore also thinks that the Talmud should be burnt. Says he, the Jews are not content with the oral law which gave Moses in writing. They even ignore it completely and affirm that God gave another law, the Talmud. The Talmud is contained matter so abusive, so unspeakable, that it rouses shame in those who mention it and horror to those who hear it. The Talmud is said to be the chief cause that holds the Jews obstinate in their perfidy. Books in which such errors occur, said Pope Gregory, says, you will cause to be burned at the stake. That is the only way of dealing with it. Eventually, the church decides to put the Talmud on trial. Not necessarily the Jews on trial, although in a way, of course, they were, but to put the Talmud on trial, to deal with issues of whether Jesus was the Messiah or not. And how could the Jews not accept that Jesus was the Messiah? And there are three major trials: Paris, Barcelona, and Tortosa. And we'll start with the one which is in Paris. Now, we have a Jewish side, Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, most well known, Moses of Gorsi, Judah, etc. And on the other side is Nicholas Donin. Now, here in the Middle Ages, introduces another concept. Every single major personality in the fight against the Talmud and against the Jews in that way is an apostate Jew. Nicholas Donin was a Jew. He saw his light and he converted to Christianity. And like many apostates, like many converts, he had to prove himself worthwhile. And he would spend his time, as others did, attacking the people from whom they came. And Nicholas Donin, therefore, is chosen by the Pope to represent Christianity in this disputation. But think not of it as a disputation. It was a forced disputation. There was no equality of argument. The argumentation went between the Jew who has controlled what he could say and the church which could say whatever it liked. And this single-pronged attack took place, that they said they have enough evidence against the Talmud to put it on trial before the Inquisition, which had the right to condemn it as part of its duty to combat heresy everywhere. An essential question would be, what is the Christian church worried about what Jews have in their works? But they did. Now the charges go on revolving around the personality of Jesus. Now, many volumes of the Talmud have been self-censored, in that any references to Jesus, because they're not always suitable, are not quite ideal. So they've been removed. But you can today buy, of course, many Talmuds which include all these sentences. The problem is that whilst we are looking at the Talmud with sensitivity, the Christian world then, and today, and many times in anti-Semitic literature, picks out sentences out of context and then throws them at the Jews. The Jews are totally associated with Jesus. The very titular above the cross, of course, says INRI, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And there are several passages reading there in the Talmud which are believed by some scholars to be references to Jesus. The name used in the Talmud is Yeshu, and that is commonly used as the name of Jesus. Many such passages have been deemed blasphemous by historical Christian authorities, including the Catholic Church. And there are many books written on that subject today. Now, the charges in Paris were that, as it said here, there are bits of the Talmud which insult, are anti-Christian, and use words like goy, akum, and avodah zorah. Now, the word goy is familiar to Jews and non-Jews around the world. The goy is seen as a slightly unsavory way of addressing non-Jews. But its origin, and in the Talmud, is not like that. This was brought about because the Christian church viewed the word goy as insulting to Christians. And maybe on occasions in the Talmud it was, but the word goy, meaning a nation, often applied to the Jewish world as well. Now, charges also came forward by the Pope at the time, quote, of stupidity, obscenity, blasphemy, with insults against Jesus and Mary, accusations against the birth of Jesus. He's referred to as a mumser, a bastard, a magician. And so that in the Talmud, in the Sanhedrin, it says, this is one opinion amongst thousands of rabbis, amongst 1.5 million words. They would discuss Christianity because the Talmud was being written at the time when Christianity was arising and when it was in opposition to Judaism. Rabbi Abahu says, if a man says to you, I am God, he is a liar. If he says, I'm the Son of Man, in the end, people will laugh at him. The argument put forward, therefore, in the Paris disputation, fourth disputation, is that the Talmud had no right to exist since it claims to rival Scripture, the 5 books of Moses, in sanctity and is associated with other movements in the Jewish world which denied the authority of the oral law. For that particular disputation, there is no reliable source. Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, mentioned on that slide originally, is where mentioned there as the main person. He was one of the great rabbis of that particular time. He is an outstanding Talmudist, but he fought against Nicholas Dodin, the Pope, and Louis IX of France. It was impossible. In a letter by the Pope before the disputation, he asked that the Pope stated, "Shall seize all the books belonging to the Jews and be held in custody of our dear sons, the Dominican and Franciscan friars." And now we come on to the most famous disputation, the disputation of Barcelona in Spain. And I bring to your notice a film, not often one giving a lecture speaks about a film, but there was a film made, The Disputation in Barcelona of 1263 in 1986 with Christopher Lee and Toya Wilcox, an outstanding film. And because the minutes of the whole of the disputation were recorded, many of the lines used in the film, which is just over an hour long, are actually stated as they were on the occasion 800 or whatever it was, 800 years ago. And I just recommend that any of you get hold of this film. It is an absolutely worthwhile gorge. It's just 1 hour. It was on the BBC at the time. Now, what they were coming to discuss at the disputation was the age-old disputation that the Messiah promised by the prophets has already appeared, that the Messiah, as foretold by the prophets, was divine and human, that the Messiah, foretold by the prophets, was fated to suffer and die, that with the advent of the Messiah, Jewish law and ritual were to lose their force. But this disputation was different. This disputation, as you'll see in the film, and if you read anything about it, was learned from an attack to attack the Talmud to prove the truth of Christianity. Now, King James of Aragon, there's a king here involved as well, was different because he wasn't against the Jews. He was a fair-minded king, and he allowed a debate in the 13th century to have freedom of speech. He said to Nachmanides, who was the Ramban, Nachmanides, the famous leader of Spanish Jewry, he said, you can say what you like. The church were abhorred. What do you mean he can say what you like? What happens if he mentioned things that are completely against truth, which are somehow he should be burnt at the stake for? And he said, no, he can say what he likes. If you can say what you like, he can say, we're going to have a fair fight. Now, Nachmanides was of a different caliber from those who had to fight his opponent, Pablo Cristiani, who was also an apostate. But Pablo Cristiani knew only limited amounts of Talmud. He didn't know all the nitty-gritty, and he couldn't argue the points. The Nachmanides was a sharp mind. And the whole of the minutes of this whole disputation are absolutely recorded verbatim. First of all by the church, and then by the Ramban, Nachmanides. He shouldn't have done it, but he did it, and he upset the king. Yet, he didn't want to go to disputation. He said, like a mouse who fears what would happen to him, I fear for the Jews and myself. The Rambam didn't want any disputation, and even though the king decided that he had won the disputation, that he had actually been victorious and argued that the Messiah has not come, Rambam rejects the Messiah. For it is the task, he says, of the Messiah to gather the dispersed of Israel. Well, they've not been gathered together. But your Messiah, Jesus, did not gather. Can you imagine saying it in the front of the leaders of the church and the king in a Christian country in the 13th century? But he was allowed to do it. But your Messiah, Jesus, did not gather one man of them and did not even live in the time of the exile. It is also the task of the Messiah to build the temple in Jerusalem. But Jesus did not carry out anything in connection with the temple. Also, it said, the Messiah will rule over the peoples, and Jesus didn't even rule over himself. And then it also argues that we said in the Christmas carol, something like Christmas and peace to all men, peace on earth. We hear it all the time in the Christmas carols and in the songs at Christmas. It says of Jesus and to the King, is there any peace on earth? Is there peace on earth? You are the most warmongering king of our times. There is no peace. So how can he be the Messiah? He has not brought peace to the world. And the Rambam was awarded by the king for his argument and his ability to argue against the Christian side. But, and now this is of the wrong page, but it doesn't matter. Certainly, you now begin that the church introduces censorship, not only burning of Jewish works, but censorship. And this is a page, it's from the Arbatorium, it's a halakhic legal work, but it shows you how the censor, therefore people with Jewish and Hebrew knowledge, would go through work after work after work. Every single work printed, which was Jewish, had to be gone through by a censor, every single page. And there, they would go through it and they would decide what could be in. So what did they decide, whether to burn or to censor? The censor was used where there was in there somewhere in the Talmud the truth of Jesus Christ, where the church could argue it out that there was truth. But they burnt it if it was seen as being heresy against Jesus Christ. Finally, we come on to, or last, we come on to the disputation of Tortosa, which is south of Barcelona, and it's now taking place a 100 and something years later in 1413, and it is the last of the major disputations, and it is the largest and most splendid of all disputations. And it lasted not for days, but this disputation lasted for 21 months, over 69 sessions, with the minutes of the meeting running to 600 pages. The Jewish side had no ability. This is another false disputation. They were under the threat of death, the Jews, during the disputation. Only the Barcelona disputation had a sense of freedom. The one in Paris didn't, and certainly not in Tortosa. We are now in the 15th century. We are in the beginning of the movement toward the final expulsion of the Jews from Spain. And so there are only 5 sessions which are written down and minuted by the Jews, and it's a very short report. It was chaired not by a king, but by Pope Benedict XIII. And he would have one aim, not only an aim to show that the Talmud was nonsense, but an aim for the total conversion of the Jews of Aragon and Catalonia. Remembering Spain is not one unified country, so of Aragon and Catalonia. On the Christian side was Hieronymus de Santa Fe, again, an apostate. And on the Jewish side was one known as Joseph Albo, Moshe ben Abbas, Joseph Alba is a well-known philosopher, but it was a crushing of the Jewish spirit. It was a disputation to deny any Jewish viability. And the disputation was in order with the fear going on in Spain at the moment of one Vincent Ferrer, who was a fanatic anti-Jew, who would see the death of Jews as being his ultimate aim. And he was part and parcel of this disputation as well. And the final disputation, this disputation was, quote, to prove the truth of Christian doctrine about the Messiah from passages in the Talmud. It was going to prove, and it had no Nachmanides, no Ramban to argue effectively against it, that the result was that the Pope and the King of Aragon issued a joint declaration condemning the Talmud and ordering its censorship, and as an aside, to reduce all the Jews to pariah status. And as I've said, by now, the situation of the Jews in Spain was deteriorating. Slide 19 shows actually an interesting thing, which is the actual book of censors. So the people who went through that page, which I showed before with all the blackings out, they actually had to, every book had to be seen, every printer had to be examined. A printer tried to print a Jewish book with heresy in it, they were denied an ability to carry on printing, and they would sign the book. And this is in the library, as you can see, of the Columbia University. And we come on now to now 1553. So we moved on now hundreds of years from when the first Paris disputation was going, and now we still have the Council of Ten in Venice in 1553, where Italy is now the main center of anti-Judaic censorship and movement by the Pope to destroy the Talmud and other aspects of the Jewish world. And they would burn, now that the burning of the Talmud, this one here was burnt in Venice, based on a papal bull of Julius III. And he is known, there's also an association there by Michelangelo, but not relevant to this particular talk. And I come to the end. Let me come to the end now. Rome. Here we've gone a full circle. The plaque is in memory of the burning of the Talmud of the 1550s, as you can see. And on it, we have Hebrew, and we have Italian, and we have Latin, all of it all together. And it's recording the burning of the Talmud in Rome in 1553. And it brings together, in a way, this one plaque, which you can see, go to Rome, you can see it tomorrow. Here you have a quote from, I won't do it in Italian, it's a word beyond me. Here you have a quote which comes from where it says TBAZ 18a, and it means Talmud Babli, the Babylonian Talmud. AZ is Avodah Zorah, which is one section of the Talmud which was completely banned by the church because it deals with paganism and it touches on Christianity. And that's in folio 18, page 8. So it's in Daf 18a. And it quotes here, exactly, it states there, in memory of the burning of the Talmud, which took place, a recordo del rogo del Talmud, this is in memory of the burning of the Talmud, which took place in this very square on the 9th of September, 1553. But the 9th of September in 1553 was not a coincidence to the church, for they went in, the Dominicans went into all the Jewish homes and places of worship, and it was the first day of Rosh Hashanah, when they could be assured that the Jews were either in their homes or in their synagogues, and all the works were confiscated and burnt in the square. Now, the line below comes from Mayor of Rothenburg, and Mayor of Rothenburg was a pupil of Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, who fought in the Paris disputation. Mayor of Rothenburg was one of the most famous medieval rabbis, and he was present. He knew of the disputation, and he was a pupil of Rabbi Yechiel, and he knew of the burning. And when he saw 10,000, 12,000 volumes of handwritten folios of Talmud being burnt, his heart wept and he cried out. He said, invoke Shalei Srufa Ba'ish, cry out in during the fire for those who mourn your pyre. I mean, the Italian translation is not great. Invoke peace. Ask for peace for those who mourn your pyre. And this suffering of the burning of the Talmud is still read to this very day as one of the elegies on the 9th of the fast of the 9th of Av. And it was inspired by a martyrdom of Hananiah ben Trajan, who was one of the victims of Rome's persecutions before him, or before this plaque, 1,500 years before. So the church attempted to destroy the Talmud. It enacted burnings of the Talmud. It enacted censorship, and we have done some self-censorship to help. But the Talmud continues to grow. It continues to be a major part of the Jewish world's existence. And on that, I'll end my talk. And I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Shelley Shapiro comments, the 5 books of Moses detail kosher laws and circumcision, which the church abrogated very early in its history. And James Levy asks, does the Talmud mention Gentiles? Does it say anything derogatory about them?
Okay, let's deal with those first of all. The Torah, the 5 books of Moses, is, as I said, is considered a sacred, is sacred by Christians as well. There's no question they're not going to say anything derogatory about. They may have a different way of interpreting, but they wouldn't say anything derogatory about the Torah. That is the 5 books of Moses, and is considered both by Jews and Christians, as is much of the Bible, as being sacred and holy. And that's why if you go into any church, there's invariably in any church service, there will be one part of it which is dedicated to readings which come from the Torah or the prophets or the writings, that part. The Talmud, as stated, has 1.5 million words with opinions, with numerous rabbis from living all at different times, from the time before the birth of Jesus, during the time when Paul created Christianity, to the early days of the church, and the conflict, it's a big subject, and the conflict between Judaism and the genesis of Christianity. And therefore, within it, we would expect within the Talmud, there would be opinions, as one of them I quoted there, there would be opinions, yes, which would be not against Gentiles as such, but against the belief of the Gentiles, who could be Christians, but may just as well be pagans, which many of them were. So if they were living in Babylon, Iraq, they were pagans, and there was no Islam there. So yes, there would have been comments to do with the non-Jews, yes.
The Tannen asks, where in Rome can you see the plaque about the Talmud burning?
Near the ghetto.
And Gail shared a link to the film, The Disputation, on YouTube for everyone's benefit. And then we have a participant that comments, school children in Korea study the Talmud. It is part of their curriculum.
Yeah, yes. I don't know which one. Well, the one about the film is you can find it, and I highly recommend it. Go and watch it. It's done with real panache, and you've got top-notch actors. I never quite understood when it was shown on the BBC how this would be prime-time television, really, because it's very niche. It's of a particular situation, but the actors in it are superb. and it's in a very dark atmosphere. You can see the Ramban when he speaks about the potentiality of danger. You can feel what he feels. And you can see also the respect that the king has for him more than he has, and this is true at the time, it's a historical fact, that he had greater respect for the Jews running his country than he did for the Christians. Now, your second point, what was the second point?
Oh, that school children in Korea study the Talmud in their curriculum.
Yes, yes, that is true. It sounds bizarre, but there are places in Korea, and I think in Japan as well, where people actually study the Talmud. I'm sure that the bits which they study are selected out but it's a very useful way. I can only refer to my own grandfather, great grandparents, who came from Poland and knew no English, knew nothing, completely ignorant of the ways of the world, of the British Empire and Britain and England, but were very bright because they had spent years learning Talmud. And it's generally recognized the ability which you gain from spending so much time learning, arguing, debating, discussing of every nuance. Yes, so it does go on in Asia.
Wonderful. Well, this sums up our questions and comments. Thank you so much, Charles.
My pleasure.
Yes, we are so happy you were with us today. Thank you, everyone. Good evening.
Bye.